In this video, I'm gonna pick and gut an Assa 700. But before I get to the pick and gut, I wanted to actually take a couple minutes just to show off what makes this lock difficult to pick for anyone who doesn't want to sit through the whole 20 minutes of me picking and gutting it. This lock is interesting because it's difficult not because it has extra locking mechanisms like a sidebar or any kind of special trick that you have to do, but just tight tolerances and precision machining in the pieces that make them interact in such a way that the lock is just difficult, very difficult to pick. So the first thing you'll notice is kind of the format is a little weird. I'm in America, and if you're in the US as well, you've probably never seen a lock in this format unless you're a lock picker, but this is a Scandinavian oval. So this lock is from Europe. But format aside, what makes this lock interesting is how the pieces work together. And the first thing I'm going to demonstrate or show is the plug. So within the plug, you will be able to see that there's a bright line you can kind of see in some of the chambers, 1, 2, 4, and 6. And what that line is counter milling in the chamber. So there's actually a groove cut into the chamber underneath the top. And you can see my pick, if I scrape it up the side, it gets stuck in that groove. So that's going to be the section of the plug that interacts with the driver pins. Now in the chambers, these other chambers, 3, 5, and 7, there is no counter milling, and those will actually have a different type of pin in them. So the pin that interacts with the counter milling is going to be one of these gin bottle spools. So you can see they've machined down the end here so that it has it looks like a bottle top. It's got a little lip and then a very thin section and then the rest of the spool. And the size of this little lip matches the counter milling in the plug, so that if you are tensioning the lock and then you try to lift this pin, it gets stuck. The top of the bottle will fit within that counter milling, and I cannot lift it out without losing it out of my tweezers. So what you have to do to pick these gin spools, if you don't know, is basically you have to manually counter rotate the lock back and then tap on the key pins so that they will tap on this driver and hopefully knock it out of the counter milling, and then you can lift it out. So because of that, what people need to do to pick these is float pick them, either by using a tensioner that completely fills the void here, or using 2 tensioners like I'm going to, and tensioning in both directions simultaneously, so that you can be very precise in your control of the plug rotation. So once you get all the gin stuck in the milling, you can counter rotate and then start tapping them out. In addition to the regular gins, these locks often also have pins like this. I only have one in mine, which is the first pin, first driver. And this is called a Christmas tree. So you can see it's got the same ginning at the bottom, but then it's got this extra part in the middle that's going to act kind of like a spool. So this is actually the first pin I lift after I get the lock into a full set and start working on the gins. I have to lift it past that spooled part. Now, for the remaining pins, they're not just standard drivers, they are tapered. So you can see kind of down here and up here, there's just very slight tapering on these pins. And what that does is, if you're tensioning these and the force is right here, the shear line, and you start to lift them, what ends up happening is when you get to this tapering, they stop binding. So there's 3 of these pins in here, and you have to lift them all above shear line, not simultaneously, but you kind of have to lift one, and then when it stops binding, go find another and lift it, and then when that one stops binding, go lift another, so on and so forth, kind of tapping all of them in sequence over and over again until you've lifted all those. once you've lifted the tapered pins, you'll get a false set when everything else gets a gin stuck in the milling, and then you can go to work on the gins. Now, lastly, 2 of the key pins in this particular lock are these torpedo shapes. So if you overlift these, they will get stuck on this little top section. And the only way that I know of to get these to drop again is to manually counter rotate the entire lock and drop everything, basically. It wasn't a huge issue for me picking this particular lock, but I could see how those could definitely give you trouble as overset traps. So those are the types of pins that are in this lock. I only partially gutted it because the rest of the pins basically look the same. And from here, I'm gonna get it up into a vise and get it picked. Okay, I have my lock up in a vise, and let's see if I can get it picked on camera. So first, I'm gonna put my 2 tensioners in so I can do my float picking. And then I'm going to try to set the tapereds so we can get a false set here. So the tapered pins, essentially to set them, I just use really heavy tension and I tap them all a whole bunch, lifting them kind of back and forth until you get them all picked above shear. That seems to be what works for me. But I will admit, at this point, it's still somewhat of an inconsistent process, it feels like. I don't always have a good feel for, on the tapereds, whether I have overset them, and that's why I'm not getting a false set, or whether they just need to keep being lifted. I feel like in particular this one in spot number 3, I can never tell if I've set it right or if I've overset it. But I can kind of feel if I'm making progress just by, as I'm tensioning and lifting, whether I get, right there, I got a little bit of movement. I could feel the plug rotating slightly. So that let me know I was in the right place. Okay, so for the gens, the first thing I need to do is I need to lift this very first pin, which is a Christmas tree spool. Okay, to get it over the first lip. And now I can work on the rest of the gens. So I'm going to alternate between using my medium hook, my deep hook, and an offset hybrid, depending on what feels like is working the best here. The trick I was told for testing the gens to see which one needs to go was basically to put heavy pressure on it and kind of pulse it or jiggle it. And if you get movement in the plug, that means that that gin in particular is really set into the milling and is probably the next one to be lifted, but lets you know that for sure it's not set. So that's kind of what I'm going to be doing here. You may have seen I've got a couple marks on the face of the lock. There's one mark on the plug and then two on the body itself, and those let me know the rotation of the plug when nothing is set and the rotation of the plug when it's in a full false set. So I can tell, number one, where not to counter rotate back past, because otherwise I'll drop everything, and when I get something set where I want it to be set to let me know that I have moved everything back in such a way that I haven't accidentally just lifted one of the gins up part way, for example, and I'm still stuck on a lip somewhere. Trying to figure out. I know that the second gin is set. This first one is a little harder for me to tell. It feels okay. I think I may not have gotten the one all the way in the back here, which is, in my experience with this lock, the hardest one to set. I don't know if that's just because of this particular lock or if that's a general rule, but it feels like it's always really, really stuck in the milling, and it takes a lot to get it out, and I'm always afraid I'm gonna start dropping things. there we go. It was that last one. Okay, so it was the last one that wasn't lifted. I got it up and I just had to redo the second gin again. Awesome. Okay, so now I'm gonna go ahead and do my best to keep this all in frame while I got the lock. I'm gonna do something a little weird with my followers here because I've got my follower that's kind of shaped specifically to fit with the back of the plug, but that one doesn't necessarily let me pull the gins out in such a way that you can see they're oriented the correct way. So I'm probably gonna run 2 followers through, so that's what I'm doing there. So I've got this clip on the back. That was a 3D printed clip because the actual C-clip for this is a big chunk of metal and it's really difficult to get on and off. So when I was progressive pinning it, I just removed it and was using this kind of plastic temporary one. Okay, so I'm gonna turn it back, put the key in, so you can see the key works there. And now I'm going to use my follower here. Okay. So I'm gonna take, where are my tweezers? Here they are. I'm gonna take the key pins out real quick. So there's a torpedo. That's a torpedo. Regular key pin. Regular key pin. This one's actually got a little bit of mastering to it. I left the mastering in that was required to keep the key working, but I took everything else out. So there's actually these two right here were mastered, and then there's one piece of mastering in the lock body itself. Okay, so I'm gonna drop that key pin. Dropped both of those. Okay, so before I gut the lock body, I'm actually going to show the milling here. So you can see the gin milling, which are those little lines. I'll actually stick my pick in there so you can see it a little better. So right there, my pick is stuck in the milling. There's no milling here on number 3 because that is one of the tapereds, but there is milling on 4. Right there, I'm stuck in the milling, and there's milling here on 6, stuck in the milling. So no counter milling, none. Counter milling, none, counter milling, and counter milling. So that's the milling in the plug. And now I'm gonna gut here. So how do I want to do this? I'm gonna run this through this way, and then hopefully I'll be able to pop the gins out such that you can see their orientation in the lock here. If this follower will, is this follower too big? Okay, this follower is too big. Okay, never mind. I'm just gonna get it this way. just moved the lock out of the frame, which would have been bad. Okay, so I'm just going to do my best here so that you can kind of see the gins as I pop them out. So here comes the first one. All right, so there it is. So you can see that is a Christmas tree. Right there. And I think I'm going to leave the springs in for right now. But just try to get the, well, maybe I'll take this one out. Springs in this are extra long. They're really hard to remove. Okay, here's gin number 2. So again there, you can see the shape. The gin bottle spool right there. 3 is going to be a tapered pin. Get the spring out here. Okay, so here comes one of the tapered pins. And I'll show these a little closer up when I have it fully gutted. Spring. Okay, this one's going to be interesting because you can see, oh, if I can give it the focus right. Okay, so there's the spool, but then this one actually had to have that master wafer on top in the lock body, because the way that this was keyed is that that particular chamber, the combination of the key pin plus the spool was a 0 lift, or slightly less than a 0 lift. So the spring kept getting caught. So I could not remove that piece of mastering, and I had to have it in the lock body. Okay, this is going to be another tapered pin. And these are going to get hard to see now because they're way deep in the lock body. But I'm going to try my best here to show the spool as it comes out here. Focus. I'm hoping you can see that. There's the top of the spool. It got caught on the follower, but you can see that it's oriented the right way. So there that one is. Spring doesn't want to come out of that one. There we go. And then finally, this last one is going to be another tapered pin. Extra spring. Okay. So I'll show these pins, if I can get this spring put in the right spot, in all the detail here. So you can see we got Christmas tree, gin spool, tapered, gin spool, tapered, gin spool, tapered. And then we have the 2 torpedoed driver pins down here. So just to give you a closer look, on the gin spool right there. So you can see it looks just like a gin bottle, and that little piece there it fits in with the milling when you're in the right chamber, and it really gets stuck. And if I pull my tweezers away, I'll drop them here. or they'll come off the pin because it gets stuck right in there, but it doesn't get stuck in this one, just in that chamber. And then the tapered pins, which are maybe less interesting, but still kind of a pain to deal with. So you can see in the edges right there, they get a little thinner, so you start to lose feedback or tension when you're trying to lift those. So combination, gin spools, tapered pins, and the matched countermilling again in the plug in those specific chambers that the gins were in, which were 1, 2, 4, and 6. Make this for a very challenging pick. Definitely the toughest lock I have picked so far. But there you go, an Assa 700 picked and gutted. Thank you for watching.